And we're live. I just had to make sure. So today, I'm soloing this, I think, unless someone is listening. Everyone is apparently on holiday, so it's just me. So we actually don't have anything for the agenda today, but I think I want to bring up not an issue, but something we discussed a few times now, actually, which is about how do we reference non-JSON data. And I have been trying to deep dive a bit into this issue because it's not as easy. It's not as easy to solve as one might think, mainly because there's no tooling that allows for this. This means that we have to code everything from the bottom up, probably. And that's going to be a bit of an issue, maybe. So let's see, Missy joining. Testing. All right, let's see. I'm just going to share my screen if I can. All right, I'm missing some permissions, 2 seconds. Well, I think I have to rejoin. I do not. I do. Hey, Missy. Missy, can you see my screen? Oh, it is nice. It's showing. Perfect. Okay, so the issue. Magic is currently working on. Let's see if I can find the issue. Magic is currently working on this proposal, which in short kind of wraps the schema format that allows you to reference, or not reference, but to inline different schema types. The problem is that this proposal assumes that you can reference non-JSON data, and that's not the case. And I'm going to go through why. So for example, down here where we, let's see if I can find it. So for example, down here where we reference a Protobuf schema. This is not allowed in the current definition of this standard, even though the tooling supports it at the moment, at least to some degree. And the reason is that our reference object, this is whenever we reference anything within the spec, it follows this standard called JSON reference. And whatever is defined within this reference object in AsyncAPI is basically just an extension to whatever this standard defines. So it's just a little bit of sugarcoating in a sense. But this is the standard that we follow. The problem is that this standard only allows JSON value to reference another value within a JSON document. And that's a problem if you try to reference Protobuf, because Protobuf is not JSON value. Now you can make some hacks to make it work tooling wise, but from a standard perspective, this draft that we're using here doesn't cut it for what we want to use it for. There's a lot of what's it called? There's a lot of different issues that kind of relate to this, or touches it a little. And I'm not entirely sure where this proposal is, like how it wraps everything together. But we can try and I'm gonna figure that one out later. So references. There's kind of two levels to this. There's from the standard perspective, and then there's the tooling perspective. A lot of the discussion that has happened so far assumes that it's actually allowed to do so. And this is because our tooling kind of supports it. In order to better understand this, I want to deep dive a little bit more into it. So references can be used multiple places within an AsyncAPI document. But it starts to get tricky when you reach the payload. And the reason for this is that let's say that you define a payload and then you say, oh, I want to reference my JSON schema. Something like this. Now, the JSON schema might define something like let's say that it defines an object and it has to validate against a property called test. And test is basically an inline another object, if that makes sense. Test 2. And this has some type, whatever makes sense, string. I don't know. Now, I'm just gonna move this down here. And then we reference the inline object. So this would be this. Yeah, whatever. So the issue here is that in tooling, whenever it finds this reference, it resolves this reference based on this standard. It has this resolution part which defines exactly how implementations can do it or may do it. For example, implementations may choose to replace the reference with the reference value. Okay, so whenever this async API document, let's just assume it's an async API document, not just a message, it means that it basically resolves and replaces the reference with whatever it had referenced, where the reference was pointing. And this is now all and good. Now we reach a bit of a problem because whatever we referenced here was a JSON schema document. And this JSON schema document has its own, how can I say it? Its own way of resolving references. So what do I mean by that? So even though that within a JSON schema, you can still use this reference keyword, it's now all of a sudden following another standard. It's no longer following this or this specific JSON reference standard. And this means that, for example, for implementation wise, this should work. But there is no tool currently that can handle resolving this reference accurately to whatever is defined within the definition section. Because this is something that's, as I understand it, is custom within JSON schema. And this is called bundling, for those that's interested. So in a sense, or at least in many of the tools, what you want to have resolved is this part. So or at least for some tooling. Others kind of need still the reference keyword, and or at least that's important in JSON schema, because this reference keyword is validating whatever is referenced. And this gets very tricky very quickly, so I'm just going to skip that. So the point is that when we reach this part, it means that we all of a sudden have to follow a new standard instead of the one that we defined with AsyncAPI. And we cannot get around this. So that's just a fact. It's just a problem we have that we have to solve somehow. But yeah, that's part of the problem. Now, if we then go back to our reference here, and then all of a sudden we want to, if we take Magic's example where he referenced a Protobuf file as the payload schema. The issue is that let's see if I can find the statement. If JSON does not have any, then there should not be implementation reference. Yeah, so the ref string value contains a URI object, and it's based on this standard. And this is the standard that JSON schema uses for defining references, and it's what OpenAPI defines. So in that regard, it's aligned. Which identifies the location of the JSON value being referenced. And that's kind of the issue. So this is not allowed. And to make matters worse, there is no standard that can replace this JSON reference, at least not one-to-one, that allows you to reference non-JSON data. So that's kind of the two problems that we have. Tooling can't handle it. There's no tooling that exists that can handle this accurately. There's no standard that we can replace JSON reference with. So we have to kind of define our own in some sense. The comments that I got regarding referencing non-JSON data has been so far that it doesn't make much sense to still call it reference, but maybe instead call it linking. So we link to an external resource. And I'm kind of and this is just thinking out loud because I have no specific proposal yet. It's just, I'm just throwing out ideas and hopefully some of them stick. So if we can, let's say that we can distinguish between referencing and linking, then we could say in the specification that references follow JSON reference, and linking defines probably our own definition or our own standard, whatever whatever that might be. I think that makes sense to an extent. So this is from the standard perspective. So our specification. And then we have if we have to create tooling to support this behavior, I think it makes sense to look at it from, like, take a step back from AsyncAPI and try and look at, okay, so we are referencing and linking to certain and following specific standards, but it's different based on whatever specification is, like where the reference is located. For example, if we have to create a tool, we might as well figure out, can we define a behavior that supports both JSON schema behavior, AsyncAPI behavior, because now we want to reference non-JSON data, and still support this JSON reference standard for any JSON data. And if there are other standards, let's say that Protobuf or XML or XSD is probably what will be defined with, it can handle whatever those inputs are based on whatever standards those specifications define it as. If Magic did have a proposal, or I think it was Magic that had it. So instead of having, so for references, we can still use ref, but for linking, I think there was talk about having something like external ref. So they use two different keywords based on whatever data was referenced or linked to. The problem about introducing both reference and linking is that, well, both of them technically is referencing something, and both of them are technically linking to something. So it's going to be a bit tricky to talk about, okay, so we link/reference something, at least in a broader sense, because you saw that I had issues formulating the definition of it there, because I can't say referencing, because referencing is only for JSON referencing, and linking is only for external non-data or non-JSON data referencing. Or they said it ref against. So there's probably linking again. So if we take this step back from the tooling perspective and say, okay, so we're creating some tools that can resolve these references. And this means, for example, that I'm just going to write it down for AsyncAPI reference object. This means that it uses JSON reference. And maybe say 2.1 3.0 because it's not related to 3.0. And then it would be great if we could engage with the OpenAPI community here, because they probably have the same problems we have, just with the reference part. So if we look at OpenAPI as well, then the 3.0 has this, is also using it's actually also using JSON reference. And then, but with a twist. And with a twist, because if we take a look at, where's the URI standard? I cannot find that. This one. So this is what references, what the value of a reference follows. This is the standard it follows, this uniform resource identifier. Within this standard, there's something called a base URI. And what is this? Well, in short, it changes relative references and how they resolve. For example, and this is if you can define a base URI. In JSON schema, they define the base URI based on this ID property. In the AsyncAPI, we don't have it. So this is technically irrelevant for us, for now, at least. But in OpenAPI, they define it in their server object. This means that now it's all of a sudden important to know, because let's say that we have this and I say, okay, so I want test2. Then it uses, so whenever this reference is resolved, and I'm assuming here, I'm 90% sure this is the case, but this means that it uses this base URI to form the result URI. So this means that I think this becomes this whenever it reaches the tooling point. And that's the same. So whether you use this or whether you use this is potato, as I understand it. So for OpenAPI, they have this, what's it called? I can even show you it here. So if you look at relative references, relative references are resolved using the URLs defined in the server objects as base URI. And this is important because that means the tooling have to support this as well and actually take a look at the server object and handle the URI respectfully. So I'm just gonna add this. And then we can take a look at JSON schema, draft 7. It uses, let's see if I can find it. I don't think they use JSON reference. I think they have defined their own their own standard for it, but they're still using this base URI standard. And uses custom standard. Where they're using the nearest ID. So let's say that, let's say this didn't have an ID. It would default to this up here instead. So any references within this object, or yeah, within this object, would use this as the base URI. So it kind of just finds the nearest ID value. And they have this custom behavior or resolution part called bundling, which I talked about before, where it can accurately, it doesn't go to this URL in order to find this schema down here. It can automatically look up all of the references within this definition part because it's loaded within memory, because that's what their standard says they should. And then we have OpenAPI 3.0 or 3.1. And this gets a little bit more tricky, especially if you want the tooling to support it. So let's take a look at the standard. And yeah, yeah, things just got more complicated. So one of the major things that got changed in OpenAPI 3.0 or 3.1 was that they replaced their entire schema format, or they are no longer using a, what's it called? Like a custom one. Let's see if I can find it. They are. Why? So yeah, they're using JSON schema draft. Bum, bum, bum. I need to find the content media types. So schema objects. Yeah. So okay. So they're still using this superset of JSON schema draft 2012, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the newest one. And if we take a look at references, what are they using there? Yeah, so they're no longer using, or at least references, this JSON reference standard. But just say that the value has to represent this and identifies the location of value being referenced. So there's no limitation to what this reference is, at least how I read it. All very fucking complicated. Okay, so what can we define here? I actually thought they used JSON reference, but apparently they don't. So Now I'm having to change a lot of things. I read to references, schema object, and create NPS. A lot of custom reference behavior. I'm just gonna leave it at that because I don't want to go through all of it again. And with draft 2020-12, they still use this custom standard where the nearest ID defines the base URI, same as draft 7. And they're still using this custom resolution part, bundling based on ID and references, where instead of looking up in the definition part, they look up in defs because this defs keyword replaced the old definitions. So yeah. And then we have what the tool must also support is that AsyncAPI 3.x reference object is all of the sudden referencing JSON and linking to non-JSON data. Of course, still to be determined because there's no proposal for it yet. Let's see if we get there. All right, so this is what I imagine the tool, if we have to develop it, has to support, because it enables a larger group of people to come together to solve this specific issue of references. Another thing we must look at is, okay, so what is the requirements for this library? So now we looked at all of the inputs it must support. And what kind of requirements is there for the library then? And this is requirements, but these requirements I'm going to list now is more specific than just for the input part. Or at least more generic. So one of the requirements is that it must make sense, must be able to handle multiple inputs. Each of them having their own behavior. AsyncAPI, and if we take a look at so AsyncAPI and OpenAPI is a bit special because we inline another standard or multiple standards, which is primarily JSON schema. But this still means that we need to be able to handle JSON schema in itself, even just raw JSON schema documents. And we also have to support these wrapper standards, AsyncAPI, OpenAPI, that can handle these reference object based on whatever the standard defines, which is one huge show. It must be able to handle multiple we must be able to handle multiple linked resources and references, or multiple linked references, linked and referenced resources. And this requirement comes back to the standard that we are going to define for 3.0, where it's both referencing JSON data and linking non-JSON data. Another requirements that we see in, and even requests from the parser perspective, is how do you support secured schemas or references, secured references? Because let's say that this Protobuf example is behind, it's hosted somewhere, and it's secured with SSL, or it's behind password protected, or I think if it's password protected, I'm pretty sure that this standard has something that can handle it, or at least how you can define it. If I'm not mistaken, let's see, schema authority. Yeah, they have some kind of user information. I have to deep dive a little bit more, but let's just say that it's behind a closed door somewhere. Then the library still needs to be able to access those resources in some way or another. So must be able to handle or to access secure remote references. At least that's the requirements I have so far. And it's probably not going to be the last. I'm just going to check YouTube real quick. I just want to see if we do not. Perfect. All right, so what are we looking for the library to do? I spoke a little bit about, well, how exactly do we want to handle these references? Because in JSON schema, it's a bit different than what we want in AsyncAPI. So what is the external API of the library? Let's call it that. So far as I can see, it's about getting the fully qualified URI for a reference. This means that for a it's basically a relative reference, because it's only here that the base URI, for example, here where we can change how references are resolved, or relative references are resolved. So we have to somehow get the fully qualified URI for it. So instead of relative references, it's basically returns, well, this. In AsyncAPI and in OpenAPI, I would say that this next one is gonna be what can I say? Resolving the references. And what I mean by this is that the implementation replaces the reference with the referenced value. So that's another one. Replace all one reference with the referenced value. And this depends on your situation, I guess, like how specific you want it. In our cases, we really want it to be replaced in many of the cases because we're just interested in the value that the reference is referring to. However, if we are introducing something like linking to an external resource, then maybe we don't want it directly resolved or replaced. But this depends on the standard. Let's see if I can clarify this. So let's say that we have this external link to a payload. And let's say that the Protobuf payload is this. I'm just gonna make it simple. So whenever it reaches tooling, or at least the parser part, do we want the document to be because remember the document, like the AsyncAPI document, is still JSON data. So how can we represent this Protobuf data in a JSON format? We could maybe have this. So we just load the data and the parsers can handle this however it wants. Maybe we want the standard to define let's say we convert Protobuf to JSON, define that behavior. That's also a possibility. So let's say that we I'm not even sure if this is possible, but I think it is. So let's say that we have Enums, and this standard, like I haven't encountered that there is a standard for this, so I'm just saying stuff that I'm not sure we can do, but I'm just gonna run with it. So let's say that we have enums and we have name. Well, that can be my enum. And then we have values. Maybe that. And then, of course, this continues. And then we maybe want to keep all of the messages. And then we have, let's just call it fields. It's probably properties as well. We could do that as well, but yeah, let's say that we transformed it to this. I don't want to keep going. So let's say that we transformed it to some JSON representation, because our standards say that it's possible to do and defines exactly how it should do it. We can do that for Protobuf. We can define this behavior for I don't think I can say Avro here, because Avro is, as I understand, is still JSON format. It's just called Avro. So in sense, it's perfectly fine. But but XML data, for example. We can also define behavior for how XML data could be transformed into JSON, or just left as whatever this fetches, if that makes sense. How did I start with that thought? Yeah, okay, so with the reference to value. So whatever this means is different from standard to standard. And then maybe it's not even possible to directly replace it, but that's another talk. Another one is resolving the reference value. The difference between this and this up here is that this only resolves the reference or the linking. So this means that it returns, for example, if this is the link, then let's say that we agree that it should just return the string content, whatever that might be, through this content keyword. So let's just forget this down here. So replacing all or one reference with the reference value is replacing this link with this, because this is what it's linked to. The other one is that the parser just looks at this link and resolves it and have it in memory, basically, and do nothing with the link. It can even say, okay, so I have some extension I can use in AsyncAPI XParser content. Let's say it places it within this instead, whatever we might agree on. So that's resolving the reference value. So it doesn't necessarily replace it. And this is important in the newer JSON schema as well, because in the newer JSON schema versions, well, you are allowed to have, you're allowed to define references alongside other keywords. That's not possible in AsyncAPI because it's, let's see if I can find the statement where it says it. Here, this object cannot be extended with additional properties, and any properties added shall be ignored. In the newer JSON schema, that is, they are allowing additional properties. So this means that here we don't want to, in those cases, you don't want to replace references with the reference value, because you might end up replacing what is already there, and there's no definition for this, like how that should be solved. So instead, they just, this reference is, whenever it is resolved within tooling, it still keeps this ref keyword, but it replaces it like so, how I understand it at least. Because this means that from a validation point of view, it can, tooling can look through all of these keywords, and then it encounters a reference, and then it can validate whatever is within this reference and then keep going afterwards. So that's why there's a distinction between those two types. Those types of API requirements. Oh, I've been rambling for an hour. I didn't even notice. So yeah, this is the primer for the proposal I'm gonna suggest probably this week or next week on how we can standardize this behavior, or at least propose a way to do it. And I'm gonna make sure to look at all of the issues that are related to it. I'm just gonna link it in chat because there's quite a few. Okay, I'm not sure I can. There's the links. I'm gonna place them within the community issue. Wait, there's more than that. There we go. Yeah, I think that's more or less wraps it, at least for this one. So yeah, if you have any questions, just jump into Slack or the issues, and I'll make sure to jump in as well. And I guess see you next time. Bye bye.